All right, everyone, welcome. We'll get started. Um, I should explain the red nose on Bill. Uh, Bernie Glassman is who's was the founder of the Zen Peacemakers and the first person to become a Zen teacher in the um, Dharma family that Shoan and I belong to. And he was a very, very serious Zen student for many years. And then at a certain point, he decided he was too serious, and and he took up clowning. He actually trained in clowning, and just to kind of um, disrupt some proceedings that he thought were getting too sanctimonious or too serious. Would carry a red nose with him, and he'd stick it on, and at inappropriate moments, actually, I'd have to say, and were ideal. The idea was to have like a court jester around. So obviously, Bill has uh, studied that as well. Yeah. And so anyway, he's emulating the. You're a jester today, I guess, Bill. So okay. So if I get too serious, feel free to shake things up. Uh, let's see. I'd like to see you all, so I'm going to get on gallery view, so I don't have to just stare at myself. Okay, so uh, Jeff Shoan mentioned that I um, I wrote this book, One Bird, One Stone, and some years ago I got the idea. Those of you who are in the Zen world know that there's a tradition of collecting stories of teachers and students and encounters between them, and there are solemn and serious stories, and there's always in Zen this kind of streak of humor and not taking things too seriously as well. So, and some of my favorite stories are of the eccentrics and uh, just the crazy wisdom teachers that are in the lineage. And when Zen came to America, well, you can imagine America in the, starting in the 50s when it really started to take hold. Your average person, Ozzie and Harriet, were not going to be interested in Zen. It was the artists and intellectuals and eccentrics that first picked up on it. And so some of the stories about them are a lot of fun. So when I was doing the book, I traveled all over the country and spoke to about 100 Western Zen teachers. My idea was to make a collection of stories similar to the ancient ones, but all based in the Western world, teachers in the Western world. So I got to meet a lot of amazing people and collect their stories. And so that's where the book came from. But it begins with an account of some of the early days of how all this got started. And I was just saying to my university class who's here with me today that it's not widely remembered now, but Zen was the Eastern tradition that arguably had the biggest influence in the early days, say pre-1960s, in breaking the ground to have all the practices we take for granted now, Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga, Tibetan Buddhism, Vipassana Buddhism, Zen, all these different forms of meditation and Eastern philosophy and practice. A lot of it started with what they called the Zen boom in the 1950s. And there was really started about 1957 in New York. The beatniks, the beat writers and poets, and other intellectuals and artists of the time got really interested in a series of lectures that were happening at Columbia University with a Zen scholar from Japan, D.T. Suzuki, who I'll say more about soon. So apparently my mother tells me, because she was in 1957 in New York, going to cocktail parties with intellectuals while she was pregnant with, guess who, me, who was born in 1957. And she tells me that Zen was all the talk, in the cocktail parties and all that, which, you can imagine they're there with their cigarettes and martinis, discussing Eastern philosophy, kind of amusing. But anyway, maybe I picked up some of the vibe because I was born in New York in 1957. So there you go. I think it was coming through the ethers. So I wanted to just start by saying a little bit about some of the early teachers and the way it all got started even before then in America. There's some few interesting stories. One of the interesting things about it is that women were really prominent. A lot of the first serious practitioners in the early days, as well as the first Americans who actually studied Zen with Japanese teachers, etc. A lot of them were women. So, and they're not as widely known, of course, sadly. So I want to bring some of that forward. So really the story of the Western world getting interested in these philosophies and practices actually started with Henry David Thoreau. He of the book Walden, which recounts his year living as kind of a semi-hermit on Walden Pond in nature in a cabin he built himself, although it's also not widely known. He was part of a movement called the Transcendentalist Poets, and they got very interested in Eastern philosophy and other things, and they actually published the first translated Buddhist texts in America in some of their publications, including extracts of the Lotus Sutra and things like that. Funny thing about Thoreau is, yes, he lived out in nature at Walden Pond in a cabin he built himself in what one might think of as hermetic solitude, but it was only a short walk really from the nearby town where his parents lived, and he took his laundry home to his mother. So those of you know the story of Thoreau, he maybe wasn't quite out there as as remote and as in the wild as one might think. But there's a story about him on his deathbed, which is in 1862, the 1900s, and just his last words were rather Zen-like. A friend asked him as he was about to die, had he made his peace with God? And Thoreau responded in Zen-like fashion, "I was not aware we had quarreled," which is pretty Zenish. Oops, if I'm going to read this stuff, I need to put on glasses. I finally got to that point where I need glasses. Okay, to read. So the first known Zen master to arrive in America was named Sokei-an Sasaki. Now Sokei-an Sasaki. Now those of you who aren't that familiar with Zen, including my university class, which is we're reading John Daido Loori's book, Zen, The Zen of Creativity, but it's a general meditation class. So just know, for those of you who haven't looked into this before, that, I don't know, the first handful of figures, their names all begin with S's, and they're all going to blur. So just let them blur. You don't have to remember the names. But the earliest known Zen master to arrive in America, it was in 1893 to speak at a World Parliament of Religions. And his name was Sokei-an Sasaki. And like a lot of the Japanese teachers who later came over to bring Zen to this country, he felt that the formalized Zen in Japan had somewhat hardened up, and it needed to get back to a more open, free, spontaneous kind of practice, which had been known in the early days of Zen in China, especially. And he felt that Americans might just be open enough and a fresh enough culture to be able to receive it. I find it kind of astounding that it actually took hold here at all, really. I think you needed the beatniks and then the hippies in the 1960s. And I think the substances the hippies took did not hurt to open up minds to a new way of thinking. But anyway, he felt like a lot of the people who early got interested in Zen, that Buddhism was a scientific way of approaching understanding the universe, that it was rational and didn't require a lot of belief structure. And so, and I think he was right. You know, as it turned out, these things have really caught on. So the reason that those of you who are in my class are able to take a meditation class for credit goes back to these people, right? So he came for the World Parliament of Religions, and then a couple, their names were Ida Russell was the woman, and Alexander was her husband. And they invited him back 12 years later to actually stay with them for a while and teach them Zen. And so the first person to undertake koan study in America in 1905, probably in the Western world, was Ida Russell. So a woman was the first person who undertook koan study with Sokei-an Sasaki. Now, those of you who know Zen know that not knowing is a very high ideal in Zen. Beginner's mind is another word for it. It's not that we can't know what we know, but we try to enter situations with an open mind so we can learn more. And actually, you know, at the bottom, Zen takes us into the heart of a great mystery, and we become intimate with the great mystery. It doesn't necessarily give us answers like, you know, what is the purpose of life? That's a human question. But dwelling in the great mystery and knowing that there's something deep and important going there and it's something that happens through years of Zen practice. And the outcome being that you no longer doubt the value of life, you know, despite the suffering, despite the difficulties, all of that. So at Sokei-an Sasaki's first big talk that he gave in America in 1906, he said the following words: "I've studied Buddhism for more than 40 years, but only recently have I really begun to understand that, after all, I don't understand anything." He's obviously making a direct presentation on, well, what I've just mentioned. Of course, the American audience, their response ranged from obvious disappointment to catcalls and hooting and laughter and booing. So nobody really got him. But he went back to Japan with this notion that America was somehow ripe for this. So he later, several members of his Dharma family came back over and proved to be really influential in the early days of Zen. One of them was named Issan Sasaki. He came as Sokei-an Sasaki's attendant to San Francisco in 1905. And the idea was that Sokei-an Sasaki was going to stay something like a year, do a lecture tour of America, teach the Russells about Buddhism. And meanwhile, Sokei-an Sasaki was his attendant and assistant, but he was also going to serve as the Russells' houseboy. Well, Nyogen Senzaki was a monk as well, so he was, an actual student of Sokei-an Sasaki's. It turned out that the Russells' housekeeper thought he was hopeless as a houseboy, and so I'll just read a little bit. So Sokei-an Sasaki sent him off on his own into San Francisco and said, "Just face this great city and see whether it conquers you or you conquer it." So this poor Japanese monk gets set off on his own into America. And he spends, his teacher, Sokei-an Sasaki, had told him to spend 20 years before attempting to teach Zen. So he spent the next 20-odd years working as a farmhand, houseboy, waiter, and language tutor before he finally founded the Western world's first successful practice centers in San Francisco, Zen practice centers, and Los Angeles. He was also a co-compiler of a bunch of Zen stories that is among the first published Zen stories in the West. The book was called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, And it was very much this collection of Zen stories. Some of you old Zennies will know it. That was definitely the genesis of the idea for this book, One Bird, One Stone, my own book, which was going to be like a follow-up to Zen Flesh, Zen Bones in a way. And Sasaki, in his years in America, also, in his approach to American culture, felt that Americans were really open and ripe for Zen practice. And this is what he wrote about why he thought Americans were well suited. He said, Americans in general are lovers of freedom and equality. For this reason, they make natural Zen students. There are 8 aspects of American life and character that make America fertile ground for Zen. American philosophy is practical. American life does not cling to formality. The majority of Americans are optimists. Americans love nature. Some of this might not be as true now as maybe he found it then, but he has something of the heart of the American attitude that eventually made us open to doing this practice, I think. He said they're capable of simple living, being both practical and efficient. Americans consider true happiness to lie in universal brotherhood. I wish we believed that more. The American conception of ethics is rooted in individual morality. Americans are rational thinkers, well, sometimes. But anyway, it's quite interesting that, like anything, Zen is all about spontaneity and freedom. But once an edifice, a bureaucracy, hierarchy grows up around any path, then there are churches, and then there's politics, and then there's power, and then there's money needed, and all the stuff grows up. And Buddhism, in its 2,500 years of existence, has gone through a number of cycles of that, are kind of hardening up and then needing to be refreshed and needing to be reawakened. I have to say that when some of these Japanese teachers encountered a bunch of beatniks and hippies who all swarmed in wanting to study Zen in the late 50s and 60s, that it must have been quite a thing. It's all I can say. It must have been quite an eye-opener. Sasaki, here's the quote by him. Zen is not a puzzle. It cannot be solved by wit. It is spiritual food for those who want to learn what life is and what our mission is. And one very well-known teacher trained with him for a number of years, Robert Aitken, who many of you will know, went on to become a very prominent teacher. Interestingly, Sasaki, he taught until, I think it was the 1950s. And when he was 83, 1957, he said he would live for exactly 1 year longer. And exactly as he predicted, it came to pass. He died a year later. And here were his last words. Do not erect a tombstone. The California poppy is tombstone enough. Friends in the Dharma, please accept my selfish request. Forget about me as quickly as possible. Well, he'll have to forgive me for speaking of his memory here. Another aside is that after Pearl Harbor in 1941, there's another Zen teacher I'm going to speak about in a minute, Sokei-an, who established the first Zen Institute in New York, so there were practice centers starting in the 30s and 40s on both coasts, and had a small number of people interested. But after Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, many of you know the story of Japanese citizens being rounded up, American citizens who happened to be of Japanese descent, being rounded up and sent to internment camps in the desert, in the mountains, etc. And Soyen Shaku, in fact, that's one of the pictures I want to show, was sent to one of these internment camps, as was Sokei-an, the other teacher we'll mention soon. And just to show something about the, oops, sorry, where am I? Hold on, I'll have it in a second. Just to show something about the adaptability of Zen, Senzaki established in the internment camp, here we go, a Zen practice temple that he called the Temple of the Eastward Teaching, and he thought even that perhaps it would help the mix of cultures, that would help Zen grow here. So he adapted and shown even in that setting. And here is Nyogen Senzaki. Come on, open up. Huh. Oh, here we go. Can you all see that picture of him? Oh, you can't. Okay.
Not yet, Sean. Maybe others can. I'm not seeing it.
Sorry. Technical stuff. There we go. There he is. Can you see him now? No, it's not working?
I'm not. Oh, there it is.
Oh, you
just
see.
came up, Sean.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Hold on, I'm getting rid of this other stuff on the screen. And then I've also got a picture of him here somewhere. Sorry, this is a little bit new to me, some of this technology. No, I guess that's the picture I have of him. Oh no, here we go. This is him at the internment camp. Come on. There we go. So they were housed in these military kind of surplus buildings. And I think there were 10,000 Japanese Americans in the camp he was in. There's an account by a man who later became a beat poet himself, a Japanese American. And the name of the mountain that they had the camp on was called Heart Mountain. So he renamed it the Mountain of Compassion, and his meditation hall of the Eastbound Teaching. So the beat poet Albert Seijo, who was in the camp as a teenager, remembers Sensaki from those years. Even as a kid seeing him in camp, I could see he walked different and stood different. I did not have to talk to him to know he was in some other space from us others. He was living out of a different place of the average and conventional. There was an area of quiet around him at all times. I'm just beginning now to fully appreciate him. So, it must have been quite a culture shock to come over and try and spread these teachings here, even in the relatively conservative era of the 30s, 40s, and such. Strangely, Soyen Shaku, who was the one who came over in 1893 and taught koan study to Ida Russell, later had came over with one of his students who was going to be a Dharma successor to him, named Zakatsu Shaku, all those S's, right? He came over with a group of 6 monks, really wanted to make a foothold here and spread the Dharma, but they had to figure out some way to establish themselves and make money. So they tried to start a strawberry farm, but they got sold really bad land in a swindle and ended up making such poor strawberries that the other local farmers laughed at them when they tried to sell them. So all the monks went back except for one of them, Sokei-an. And he remained behind and spent most of the next 20 years wandering America. He became kind of a pre-beatnik or Dharma Bum. And he became known as an artist, and he supported himself by writing accounts of his life in America and having them published in Japan. But he was known as this kind of eccentric New York artist, and I want to bring up a picture of him too. And there he is in his kind of pre-beatnik bohemian phase. I don't know why it's, there we go. Can you all see him? That's long hair for the 1920s. It's pretty radical, okay? That's him in the 1920s, and then
I'm just seeing the icon. Can you make it bigger?
you know, you're only seeing the little icon. Can you see this, hold on, there we go. Can I make it bigger? Question, good question.
Sean, we were seeing your whole page of
Right,
him.
can you see him now? There we go. Got him now? No?
Not yet.
Not yet. We're still seeing the whole folder full of images.
Geez, okay. I don't
I
know
think you need to
whether-
open the image.
Yeah, I've opened it. It's on my screen. Screen sharing is paused. Why is that? Sorry. Stop share, start share again. I apologize. I do this for my classes all the time, so I don't know why it's being difficult now. Okay. You see him now?
No.
Yeah?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, so look at that hair. It's pre-Beatles, 40 years pre-Beatles. So pretty radical for the time. So Sokei-an is kind of this Dharma Bum wandering America. And then, and he becomes kind of a literary figure back in Tokyo. Sorry, I'm undoing the share. Okay. And then one day he's walking through New York and he sees a dead horse, and he remembers impermanence and he goes back and completes his Zen training, and then comes back in 1931 and forms this practice center in New York called the First Zen Institute of America. When he goes back to Japan, he goes back to his teacher, who was Soyen Shaku, and this is an account of their first meeting. The master, having heard Sokei-an was a wood carver, said, "How long have you been studying art?" Sokei-an says, six years. He had gone to college 6 years to study art and carving. Soyen Shaku says, "Carve me a Buddha." So Sokei-an returns a couple of weeks later with a wooden statue of the Buddha, hands it to Soyen Shaku. Shaku says, "What's this?" And he throws it out the window into a pond. It seemed unkind, Sokei-an would later explain, but it was not. He'd meant for me to carve the Buddha in myself. So that's kind of a classic Zen story that seems, it's a little bit of a shock tactic, right? But in the Zen world, that kind of direct presentation, demonstration is not that uncommon. So the important point that I want to share about the Zen Institute, First Zen Institute, is that there are two women students there who are very, basically run the whole place. Mary Farkas is one of them, and she was eventually presented the purple robes of a Zen master. So arguably she might have been the first American Zen master, although she didn't wear them often. She didn't make a lot of fuss about it, but she basically ran the institute. They published a magazine called Zen Notes for decades. And the other woman was Ruth Fuller Everett, who was a society woman and an heiress. And she got deeply, deeply involved in the training of Zen. And eventually, after Sokei-an was also sent away to internment camp in the 40s, when he came back, they married. So she became Ruth Fuller Sasaki. And she later went to Japan to continue her Zen study and ended up becoming the first Western abbess of a Zen temple in Japan, as well as the first American to ordain. So let me get pictures of these up. Here is Ruth Fuller Sasaki in her society woman days. Can you see her?
We're still on the icon screen again.
Weird. What keeps happening with that? Okay. Start again. There she is. You got her? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. She doesn't look like the most likely person to later become a Zen master, but in fact, she does. And when she becomes the Zen master, she looks like this. And I'm going to read an account of how that happens with her. Sorry, I sometimes think of the technology. It's nice to see the pictures, but it's kind of only partly worth it. I wanted to share Mary Farkas too, who is the other prominent woman who. Can you see her? No, it's frozen.
We're back on the icon screen again.
Jeez, why does that keep happening? Okay, here we go. Hold on. Got her now, don't you?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, there we go. I don't know why after I click the icon screen, the screen sharing pauses, and I have no idea why that's happening. I apologize. And we'll give it another try with Ruth Fuller Sasaki as a Zen priest. Can you see her now? Yeah, so that's her in her full Zen robes, and etc. So she wrote an account of how this went back to the first Zen Institute, and I wish I could exactly get across how peculiar all this would have been, but maybe her own words say a little bit about that. So she went back, and after Sokei-an died, Sokei-an's health was ruined by being in the internment camp, and they married. I think they were only married for a year or two before he passed away. So she says, the appointment of myself, an American, as a priest of a Rinzai Zen temple is unique in the history of that sect. The fact that I am a woman is not of such importance, for there have always been, at least in Japan, some temples presided over by nuns, to which category I now belong. And this is so. There were always occasionally women who became Zen masters and abbots of temples in Japan. She says, upon ordaining as a priest, it's customary to take the monk's vows from one's teacher, and then usually one's head is shaved. But do not fear, my hair has not been cut off, nor will it be. There are rules for exceptional cases. In the course of this very simple ceremony, I was taken to the main hall of the monastery and allowed to burn incense before the figure of Daido Kokushi, the founder of the line of Daitokuji teaching, which would have been centuries old at this point. This life-size figure carved of wood has been placed deep within the main shrine. Daido Kokushi sits, as he must often in life, full of power, his eyes, now made of glass, glaring in the light of the candles. And it's quite an experience to walk into that shadowy place and stand face to face with the old man. Alone at the altar of the founder of Daitokuji, I bowed 3 times, forehead on the ground, then entered into the deep recesses of the altar, where only disciples in Daito Kokushi's line may enter. And I bowed again and burned incense before the life-size figure seated in its depths. So that was 1958. So, first Western Zen priest, first Western abbot of a temple, first Western Zen master, Ruth Fuller Sasaki. So, again, I like the, I'm maybe too fond of the eccentrics, but here's an account of Sokei-an even after he came back and became a Zen master. Oh, I didn't bring up the picture of him as a Zen master. Quite different from the Dharma Bum look. There he is later on. Oh, geez, it stopped again. So there we go. Got him?
Got him.
Yeah, so that's him later when after he finished his training and came back. But he always remained eccentric, and I love this little clip from one of his talks that was reported by Alan Watts. And a lot of you know Alan Watts as continues to be a popular purveyor of Zen philosophy. If you look on the internet, if you Google Alan Watts, you'll find still many, many of his talks about Zen. And incidentally, Sokei-an had told Alan Watts once that it was reading one of the Transcendentalist poets, Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, that triggered his first Enlightenment experience. So kind of full circle, the debt of the East got slightly repaid. Anyway, one evening, Watts reports, Sokei-an, dressed in his formal brown and gold brocade robes, was delivering a lecture on the Sutra of Perfect Awakening before a distinguished New York audience when he made the statement, in Buddhism, purposelessness is fundamental. No purpose anywhere in life itself. When you drop fart, you do not say, at 9 o'clock I dropped fart. It just happened. So I'll move on a little bit here. So another woman who's very influential in the early days of Zen is an English woman named Jiyu Kennett. She later established the Shasta Abbey, which is a huge practice center in Northern California, and she ended up ordaining more than 100 Western Zen monks. But first she had trained in Japan for many years, and she became probably only the second Westerner to become the abbot of a temple in Japan. So she's quite interesting person, and she actually went through quite a lot of difficulty in her training and hazing, being treated not quite as well as the monks, being a woman, and I think she suffered a little more of that than Ruth Fuller Sasaki did. But there's this little story about her while she was there in Japan training. So when Jiyu Kennet was training at Sojiji Temple in Japan in the early 60s, she was surprised one day by the arrival of an important visitor. As Kennet tells it, she had just come back from an outing to find a large contingent of priests and ladies in the abbot's guest apartment. In the center, there was one middle-aged lady who looked rather kind. The woman smiled as Kennet approached, and since introductions did not seem to be forthcoming, she says, "I held out my hand." The visiting woman shook it with great glee, obviously enjoying herself and thoroughly pleased. I noticed everyone else seemed to be startled, but since no one explained who she was, I felt I had done the right thing. To my delight, she began speaking in English, telling me how delighted she was that I was there and hoping to see me again on her next visit. Shortly thereafter, Kennet returned to her quarters, where the director of the temple soon called on her. "I want you to shake hands with me," he announced. "May I ask why, Reverend Director?" Jiyu Kennet responded. "You shook the hand of the Empress of Japan. No living person has touched that hand other than the Emperor. You do not realize what a great thing you have done." A moment later, her door swung open again to reveal the entire staff of the temple, waiting with outstretched hands, and even a larger group of junior trainees and monks behind them. I suppose, Kennet wrote later, that shaking the hand of her who shook the hand is the next best thing to shaking the hand. Apparently it was not done to touch the Empress. So on to the beats, and many of you will have read Jack Kerouac at some point, the most famous of the beat writers. And somehow in the 1950s, he happened upon a book on Buddhism, and it basically made incredible sense to him. And he just started talking about it and spreading the word and got the other beat poets and writers interested, and many other artists and intellectuals. So, but they're kind of funny because they were into this underground hipster movement, and the way they talked is like, beatnik hip and stuff. So I always find it very amusing to read the way they wrote about Buddhism. But this is what Kerouac wrote to the poet Allen Ginsberg after making this discovery in 1954. He wrote, "I made this discovery of sweet Buddha. I always did suspect that life was a dream, and now I am assured by the most brilliant man who ever lived that it is indeed so." Another beat poet who is still alive and later became trained for many years in Zen, and was very influential in spreading the word in America about the practices. He writes to Gary Snyder in 1956. This is Kerouac still speaking. "I'm so humbled now before the spectacle of these magnificent Zen men forsaking alcohol and tobacco to just watch cows in the hazy moon and just make it off what is there, the objective, beautiful, and ungraspable world as it is. Although really, frankly, I think an American Zendo with no rules at all, and all the cats talking all day whenever they felt like it, and orgies at night with the Shaktis would be the best thing." Allen Ginsberg had one of the other beat poets had also in the early 50s started reading in Buddhism, and he wrote to another friend of his, Neil Cassidy, who, for those of you who know Kerouac, is the Dean Moriarty figure in On the Road, his book On the Road. This one really kind of cracks me up. Allen Ginsberg says, I am on a new kick 2 weeks old, a very beautiful kick, which I invite you to share. I am now spending all my free time in Columbia Fine Arts Library and New York Public Library, leafing through immense albums of Asiatic imagery. I'm also reading a little about their mystique and religions. If you begin to get a clear idea of the various religions, the various dynasties and epochs of art, and messianism and spiritual waves of hipness, wow, You understand a lot of new mind and eyeball kicks. Mind and eyeball kicks, okay. I've begun to familiarize myself with Zen Buddhism through a book by one D.T. Suzuki. Zen is a special, funny, late form with no real canon or formal theology, except for a mass of several hundred anecdotes of conversations, koans, between masters and disciples. These conversations are all irrational and beguiling. They are given to Zen novitiates and made up as they go along sometimes, until the novitiate is completely beflabbered intellectually and stops thinking. Then finally one day he gets the big point and has what is known as satori, or illumination. This is a specific flash of vision which totally changes his ken. They refuse to have a theology or admit that one exists or anything verbal at all. That's the point of these anecdotes, to exhaust words. Then the man sees anew the universe. And this is, as my wife said when I was talking to her about the talk last night, a little Kerouac goes a long way, but I do want to share something that he wrote in 1957, predicting that Zen was even going to get bigger in 1958. 1958 will be great year of Buddhism, already big stir in New York about Zen. Alan Watts, big hero of Madison Avenue, and big article about Zen in Mademoiselle magazine mentions me and Allen Ginsberg, and the author knows her Buddhism good. And now with Dharma Bums, which is his next novel, which, if you haven't read it, I recommend it. He captures something of the essence of Zen in 1958 somehow, although he never really practiced, he only read about it. But anyway, now with my book Dharma Bums, I will crash open the whole scene to sudden Buddhism boom. And look what will happen closely soon. Everyone going the way of the Dharma, no shit. Then with arrival of Gary Snyder, smash, watch, you'll see. It'll be a funny year of enlightenment in America. Everybody reading D.T. Suzuki on Madison Avenue. That in itself mighty strange. So D.T. Suzuki was pretty much the first translator to write books and to see to the publication of books in English on Zen. And those of you who have been practicing for a long time will no doubt remember those books. There was a time in the 50s and early 60s where if you want to read about Zen, you read D.T. Suzuki. He was a Japanese scholar who had started out as a monk and in fact had a sanctioned big enlightenment experience, so he knew from the inside, and officially sanctioned, meaning, you know, it was officially noted that he'd had this experience. After which he was given the Dharma name, like mine is Tetsudo. When you, certain points in your training, you may be given a particular name. And DT stands for, I'm not going to get it exactly right, Dai, which means great, and the T stands for a word that means stupidity. So he became enlightened, and his teacher gave him the name Great Stupidity, just to make sure that he was, you know, stayed humble. And there's a story about, I'll just tell it from memory because I know it well. So sometime around this point in the late 50s, D.T. Suzuki came over. Part of the stir in New York was he was giving a series of lectures on Zen in the late 50s at Columbia University in New York. And many of the artists and intellectuals of the time went and participated in these and got interested because of his lectures. But also at this time in the late 50s, he was invited to England to participate in a big convention on religion. And this gathering was to happen at the Queen's Hall in London. And it's to be on the subject of the supreme spiritual ideal. Now you have to put your mind back there and imagine the Queen's Hall in London in the late 50s, a bunch of experts are going to get on stage and talk about the supreme spiritual ideal. Can you imagine a more stuffy convocation? It's going to be a bunch of white men in suits coming up one after the other and explaining to the audience from their role as experts exactly what the supreme spiritual ideal is. So a bunch of these guys do get up and give their presentations, and then it's DT Suzuki's turn to come up onto the stage. He's about 5 feet tall, so he must have barely been able to look over the lectern, you know. And so he comes up on stage, looks out at the audience, and he says, I really don't know how a humble person like me is supposed to speak on such a grand thing as the supreme spiritual ideal. He says, really, I do not know what supreme means, what spiritual is exactly, or what the supreme spiritual ideal is. And after that, he follows by talking to the audience informally about his house and garden in rural Japan and how life there differs from life in a big city. When he's finished, the audience gives him a standing ovation. Now, how refreshing must it have been for somebody to come up and, you know, when I'm more in a discussion mode, I often ask a group what they think, why they think the audience gave him an ovation. What did he do? And, you know, people always end up finally saying that he demonstrated the supreme spiritual ideal, humility, rather than talking about it. So that's such a Zen approach. You know, don't talk about this thing intellectually, practice it, embody it, and demonstrate it. And in so doing, he breaks down that barrier that would have been established between him and his audience. And they all just spontaneously leap to their feet and give him a standing ovation. So obviously they appreciated it. I'm going to move on a little bit here. One of the really well-known artists who really took to Zen in the late 50s was a composer named John Cage. I'm sure some of you know of him. He was at a point where he was really discouraged about his direction in composing. Could anything new and different be done in composing? And also he was just feeling discouraged and like contemporary life was empty. Everything that was happening in arts and music was dull and boring. And he just had no sense of direction. He was thinking of abandoning music composition altogether and just going into psychoanalysis, receiving psychoanalysis, when he ran across these lectures and started attending them by DT Suzuki. And his life was just overturned. Again, a lot of these people didn't sit down and do the practice, but there was something in the air at the time, an atmosphere of openness or something needing to change from, you know, the Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, late 50s. I'm sure those of you who were there remember how just conventional and stiff everything was. But underground, one of the things Kerouac prophesized in his book Dharma Bums, which was published in 1958, which he soon foresaw a rucksack revolution, he called it, of seekers wandering all over America, searching for the truth. And kind of amazingly, not even 10 years later, the whole hippie thing happened and it more or less came true. So these people were seeing something in advance of everyone else. So John Cage was so influenced by this that, I'll read a little bit here from it. He sought to create an ego-free, intentionless approach to musical composition that involved elements of chance. Some of you may have heard of his most famous composition. It was called 4 minutes, 33 seconds. And the way it was done, again, you got to imagine an audience in the late 50s in New York coming in well-dressed for a concert by this important composer. And the way the concert unfolds is this. He walks in, opens up the piano, flexes his fingers, looks at the audience, maybe gives them a little bow, prepares himself, sits down in front of the piano, and proceeds to do nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Then he gets up and leaves. and that's the performance. So it caused such an outrage. People were just outraged. But the way it functioned is a couple of different ways. One, of course, is just to upend people's expectations of, again, similar to T. Suzuki, that somebody is the grand master here on the piano and is going to be, offering something to the rapt audience. It's also, of course, about emptiness, because he became a real follower, at least, of the philosophy of Zen. And but the other thing is, he was very fascinated by the natural sounds of any environment. And so the soundtrack for the composition actually becomes everyone shuffling around in their seats, coughing. Today it would be cell phones going off. It's just the natural noises of the environment. That was his intended. To him, any collection of sounds was worth listening to. And there's a story about him visiting Alan Watts and sleeping over on Alan Watts's couch for one night. And there was a hamster in a cage in the same room, and it would run on the little squeaky wheel, that they run on. And Alan Watts comes in to take the cage away so that John Cage will have silence and can speak. And Cage stops him and says, "Oh, no, I've already been enjoying that beautiful sound already. It's a perfect melody, and I will use it as a lullaby to send me off to sleep." So he insists on listening to the hamster wheel all night as music. Somewhere during this period, he was invited to give a grand lecture at an big artist, hoity-toity artist club in New York. And he gave this really infamous talk, which has become known as his lecture on nothing. And I just want to read you the first little bit of what he comes in and says in this grand lecture. "I am here, and there is nothing to say. If among you there are some who wish to get somewhere, let them leave at any moment. What we really require is silence. But what silence requires, in this context, is that I go on talking. Give any one thought a push, it falls down so easily. But the pusher and the push produce that entertainment we call discussion. Shall we have one later? Or we could simply decide not to have a discussion, whatever you like. But now there are silences, and the words we make help make the silences. I have nothing to say, and I am saying it. That is all the poetry as I need it in this space of time. We need not fear silences. We may love them. This is a composed talk, for I am making it just as I make a piece of music. It is like a glass of milk. We need the glass, we need the milk. Or again, it's like an empty glass, into which moment anything may be poured as we go along. Who knows? An idea may occur in this talk. I have no idea whether one will. Or not. If it does, let it. Again, it seems, well, I find it refreshingly nutty. He's trying to turn over what everyone thinks of as an expert, as a lecturer, as what everyone thinks of as a composer, as somebody who's got special talent. Anyway, he's very interesting. If he's of interest to you, you might give him a look. I want to jump forward a little bit here, and I want to leave time for us to do some Q&A at the end. And obviously, there's only I can only just scratch the surface on some of this stuff. These practices become so widely spread in America, and I particularly wanted to share some stories about some of the lesser known figures, and also honor the women especially, because without them, we might not have all these things available to us in America today. But an interesting meeting, for those of you who know of Suzuki Roshi and the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, some of you in my class may not be familiar with that book, but if you want to read like the seminal book on Zen that came out in the 60s, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind is it. And it was written by Suzuki-Roshi, Shunryu Suzuki, who came over from Japan in the late 50s and started the San Francisco Zen Center, which has become one of the largest Zen centers in America. And the funny thing is he had always wanted to come over to America, and he'd even learned English because he thought one day he would come. But he came over in his 50s, which means he had this dream from before the First World War, not to mention the Second, and carried it all the way through. And eventually he was able to get an assignment from the Soto Church establishment in Japan to come over to attend. They thought they were sending him to attend to the Japanese immigrant population in San Francisco, which was big, and to provide them church-going opportunities. In Japan, mainstream Buddhism is much like church on Sunday. Not so much these days, but to an older generation it was. And even though the whole point of Buddhism is to meditate, basically there were an awful lot of people in the everyday population who would just go to Zen service just like people go to church on Sunday here. And they didn't necessarily meditate or practice. So Suzuki-Roshi thought he was coming over to attend to that flock of Japanese Americans who wanted that. And he was rather amazed, I think, when all these beatnik types with sandals and, unconventional clothing showed up, and with all this hip language and everything, and want to learn about real Zen and start meditating. And so he turned the whole thing over and started catering to those people and leading meditation for them. And his whole Japanese congregation got outraged and left. But anyway, he was very pivotal in establishing. Also, those of you who know Tassajara Monastery, which is an area of hot springs, which is also open to the public. There's a monastery there, and Green Gulch Farm, which is an organic farm, and Zen Center, all in the San Francisco area. Region, larger region. And Suzuki-Roshi passed away in 1969 or 70. But his son, Hoitsu, who inherited the family temple, as it was commonly done in Japan, so was also a Zen priest. He came over in this century, I'll say, some time ago, 10 or 15 years ago, to dedicate a temple that was called Dragon Mountain Temple, a Zen center that some friends of mine were establishing in Crestone, Colorado. And so I had the opportunity to go up and meet Hoitsu Suzuki, who's Suzuki-Roshi's son, and now runs the family temple in Japan, but was also pivotal in, after Suzuki-Roshi died, there's a process one goes through to become a teacher, if you don't know, called Dharma transmission. There's a whole ceremonial aspect to it. And Hoitsu took over that role for some of the teachers who were about to be named teachers at San Francisco Zen Center. So he would come back and forth to do some of the work his father had started. But he also became the head of practice at Eiheiji, which is the biggest Soto practice center, Soto Zen practice center in Japan, which means it's also maybe the biggest practice center in Japan. He was, at the time I met him, he came over to do the ceremony for my friend Stephen Angelique's going to be temple in Crestone. And he, at that time, he was head of practice at Eiheiji, which means he was in charge of training and disciplining all the hundreds of young monks and priests who would come through. Basically, anyone in the Soto sect goes through a few years at Eiheiji for their training before going off to become a temple priest. Just like somebody would be a priest in Tennessee somewhere here. They go all over Japan, but everyone first trains at Eiheiji. who's in the Soto sect. So he's got one of the most prominent positions in Zen in Japan. So he's kind of a big deal. He comes over to dedicate this land for my friend Steve. So my friend Steve Allen, who's also a Zen teacher, calls me up one day and he tells me that Hoitsu Suzuki is coming to dedicate their land and did I want to come up, and they're having a little celebration. So of course I say, yeah, Tanya and I, my wife, will certainly want to come up. So we've no sooner hung up the phone than Steve dials me right back and he says, oh, bring your guitar, would you? Roshi likes American music. Oh. So I packed my car into the car trunk with a feeling of mild trepidation. As the head of Suzuki Roshi's lineage in Japan and the head of practice at Eiheiji, he's one of the most important Zen masters in Japan. And now I'm supposed to conduct a sing-along for him. But Steve is a Zen teacher as well as a friend, and he's more or less given me an assignment. I'm going to have to show up for it. So we drive up to Colorado, and I'll read a little bit from this account. My impression of Hoitsu Suzuki Roshi is far from intimidating. Polite, soft-spoken in broken English, he greets Tanya and me at Steve and Angelique's Crestone home, clad in his humble monk-around-the-house attire. He asks to be addressed simply as Hoitsu. He looks tired, almost frail. He'd be the picture of ordinariness, which is quite a high aspiration in the Zen world, except for his disconcerting resemblance to his father, which is so close to the many photos and film images I've seen that it's quite eerie. It's as though Suzuki Roshi the Elder has miraculously come to life in order to dedicate this land for a new temple. And in a way, I suppose he has. My second impression is that Roshi and his wife seem almost shell-shocked by the drive they've just taken. Albuquerque is about 5 hours south of Crestone, and once you pass Santa Fe, the only town of any size is Taos. It's just sagebrush and mountains for mile upon mile, with maybe an occasional cow or farmhouse. It's a stretch of open, unpopulated land, unlike anything that exists in Japan. Later, he came back and led a retreat, which I also attended, and he brought 5 monks from Eiheiji with him. And when I came up and met them just before the retreat, all their eyes were like saucers. They just never seen anything like that open land. You could probably drop all of Japan in that space between Albuquerque and Crestone, you know? And so Crestone stands at the foot of the northern Sangre de Cristo Range, a jagged line of craggy snowcaps that rise high up from the sandy desert floor of the San Luis Valley. They look very much like the spine of a dragon, hence the proposed name for the practice center, Dragon Mountain Temple. Currently, the structure is defined only by a small circle of straw bales standing in the middle of the Sage and Cactus Valley floor with the mountains behind, and a vision in the minds of Steve and Angelique and their small but dedicated community of practitioners. Today's land dedication ceremony is a tradition used not only to bless the site, but to invoke the help of any Buddhas or Bodhisattvas, ancestors, or other positive energies who might happen to be lurking around and might listen in. One might wonder whether there really are celestial beings or energies who might take an interest in what we're doing here. But don't ask most Zen teachers, you're unlikely to get a straight answer. My personal take on it is something like this. Practice, Zen practice, as well as the laws of physics, science, show us that space and time, as well as every other aspect of the world, all of which seems so real, are actually relative, conditioned and embellished by our human perception, to the point where we really can't tell what's real and what isn't. So who are we to say that something or someone that seems imaginary, like, say, celestial beings like bodhisattvas, aren't real? Anyway, isn't reality a concept created by the human mind? So can we even say that reality is real? In any case, the wind comes up, as it always does every time I participate in a ceremony in Crestone, just as we approach on foot across the sandy plain. The straw bale ring seems somehow symbolic and mystical standing out there. It's the largest, most symmetrical, and only human-constructed object on that flat open space. It looks almost like the ruined remnant of some lost civilization, perhaps Strawhenge. We circumambulate the ring, led by Stephen Huitsu. Then as we enter, the world swirls again in a spiral of dust, blowing over a vase of flowers on the altar beside the Buddha. The vase cracks in two and water flows over the altar, around the Buddha's feet and over the edge. Without missing a beat, Angelique simply picks up the flowers and threads them through the Buddha's arm, as though he was on his way to a wedding, turning it all into a kind of blessing. The monks take off the baseball caps, which have been protecting their shaved heads from the fierce sun of our 8,000-foot elevation. We begin the traditional chanting, bowing, and offering of incense, there beneath the craggy spine of the Blood of Christ Mountains, Sangre de Cristos, accomplished by the throbbing of a Native American drum in honor of the ancestors of this land. Huitsu has become a commanding presence, standing in the wind in his Roshi's robes. And although he speaks words of dedication in Japanese that none of us Americans can understand, it seems there is nothing lacking here. Later that evening, we find ourselves sitting around in Steve and Angelique's house after dinner, with a dozen or so members of their community, a few more visitors, and Huitsu and his wife. My moment of truth has clearly come, and I pull my guitar from its case. I begin carefully, my voice a bit unsteady until it forgets itself, starting with songs I'm pretty sure anyone will at least be able to hum along to. Hey Jude, Proud Mary, Knocking on Heaven's Door. But pretty soon everyone's swept up in the mood, singing and clapping along with smiles on their faces. Huitsu sings along in his broken English to Summertime and Scarborough Fair. Has the postmodern world truly arrived? Here's a Japanese Roshi singing Simon and Garfunkel in this tiny forgotten mining town in the southern Rocky Mountains, where the nearest major airport is 5 miles away, is a 5-hour drive away. And all the problems of the world, for the moment at least, seem a lot farther than that. Somehow everything seems to have gotten all mixed up. I launch into House of the Rising Sun, which I'm pretty sure everyone will know, and I'm a good way into the opening verse before it strikes me. Here we sit with our honored guests, one of the most prominent religious personages in Japan, with his elegant, dignified wife, and I'm singing a song about a brothel. House of the Rising Sun is about a brothel. Some of you may not know that, but it is. A song, however, is a lot like a trap. Once you've started into its 3 or 4 minute duration, it's pretty hard to escape. In any case, there seems to be no problem. Look, there's Huitsu Roshi and his wife swaying shoulder to shoulder with the music, singing some version of the lyrics and smiling away. It's not till later, when Tanya points out that Japan is called the land of the rising sun, that occurs to me the song might have a kind of accidental double meaning that could lend itself to a completely different interpretation. Huitsu and his wife may have heard the lyrics quite differently. After all, any Zen temple that comes from a Japanese lineage might also be described as a house of the rising sun. This is fitting enough, since all Buddhist teachings tell us that enlightenment can only occur here, in the human realm of samsara, in the same way a lotus arises from muddy water. The next morning, I present Huitsu and his wife with a copy of my Western Zen Chronicle, One Bird, One Stone, as a gift to take back to the family temple in Japan. The book not only prominently features Huitsu's father, Suzuki Roshi the Elder, but it took its title from a quote by his father, which appears in this way in the opening to the book. Suzuki Roshi once told a group of American students, "You have a saying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, but our way is to just kill 1 bird with 1 stone." I want to, in later editions of the book, put a little postscript underneath that saying, no birds were actually harmed in the making of this book. This is the first copy I know of this book that'll go back to Japan, completing a kind of circle. Moreover, it's going back to the home temple of Suzuki Roshi, who was pivotal in bringing Zen to the West, and whose Zen mind, beginner's mind, was instrumental in setting me on the Zen path, and whose words gave my book its title. It's circles within circles within circles. When I finally managed to get the gist of the story across to Huitsu, his face lights up in a brilliant smile. "Ah, yes," he says in understanding, taking the book from me, putting his hands together in gasho and assuring me it'll find a good home in the temple. Then he turns away to put the book in his luggage and gather things from upstairs. And a little while later comes the time when we almost part. Ah, Hoitsu says as a goodbye with a small polite bow. It was very good to meet you. He puts his hands together again as though in gassho, and then he opens and closes them like a book. He catches my eye with a twinkle as though to see whether I've gotten his joke, and he opens and closes his hands once more. And his face lights up again in that smile of 1,000 rising suns. I want to save some time for questions and comments and etc. So we've only been able to scratch the surface. Maybe we have to do, Sean, maybe we have to do 5 more talks on this subject because there's a lot more people want it. I'd be glad to just field some questions, hear anything from anyone who wants to speak, ask, comment, tell a joke, Bill.
And there are more of you than I can see. So if you'd like to share something, go ahead under reactions. You can raise your electronic hand, and we'll call on you. We have just about 10 minutes here. So
Sean, what's the sound of one electronic hand clapping?
Did you hear about the guy who asked the hot dog vendor, the Zen student, make me one with everything?
Very good, thank you. I knew we'd hear something from you.
How do you raise your hand?
Sorry, what?
How do you raise your hand?
go down under reactions, and it says.
Anyway, you're raising your actual hand. Hey, Ben, how you doing?
Hello, Sean. I just wanted to say, hey, has everybody seen the movie? I think it's called Perfect Days, based on a Lou Reed song. It's by Wim Wenders. It's set in Japan. And I won't say any more, but at one point, the song House of the Rising Sun features prominently.
Oh, really? Okay, tell me, it's Perfect Days, huh?
Perfect Days. It's about a toilet cleaner in Tokyo. It's an amazing movie.
You know, after when I was first formally authorized as a Zen teacher, every time I went back to my home center, which is up in Berthoud, Colorado, where my teachers teach, I would be, in Zen, there's always a work detail. For probably 3 years, I was assigned toilet cleaning every time, which is exactly so Zenish and so appropriate. And it's such good work to do, cleaning toilets. Nothing better, especially if you become a teacher and they want to make sure that you're not too full of yourself. So
every time I go to the ashram in the Bahamas, Shivananda ashram, which I think you have spoken at, I am the garbage man every time.
Well, it's the noblest work.
Cool. Nice to see you all.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Ben. Anyone else? Go ahead and Doreen, hi. Go ahead and unmute and share.
Well, I have this book called Sun House by David James Duncan, which is an incredible tome. I just have to say, it took him like 16 years to write, but it might be kind of like the Dharma Bums of current times, because he talks a lot. He has a lot of characters that are spiritual seekers, and he is quite the philosopher and Zen student, and he's quoting Dogen in there and quoting Gary Snyder, and I mean, it's an incredible book.
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah.
Tell me the author's name again.
Yeah. Well, it's called, if you look up Sun House, you'll find it.
Okay.
And also, I just want to say thank you, Sean, because you're a great storyteller, and I really feel like you should do some more talks.
Thanks, Doreen. I enjoyed it. It's fun. It's so much fun to share this. I've got tons more. which of course I thought I'd get through twice this much, but you know, that's the way it goes, doesn't it? Oh,
Anyone else?
We have to have a
we got a
picture
few
of
more minutes.
Kerouac. Sorry, I got to put up the picture of Kerouac. Sorry, apologies, but it must be done. Let's see. There's Jack Kerouac. Okay. Come on, Jack. There you go. And again, the screen sharing pauses every time I open it. Isn't that weird? Okay. 1 second and we'll have it. At least I know what it's doing now and how to get around it. There we go, Jack Kerouac. You see him?
Yeah.
It's kind of the famous picture of him. Dharma Bums it's not exactly real Zen, but it's well worth the read. He gets something of the spirit of why this stuff caught on in America. And actually, it was Jack Kerouac's Dharma Bums plus the Beatles that got me into meditation to begin with. So I completely entered through pop culture.
David Scott, you've got your hand up from LA. Hi.
Yes, hi. I appreciate this talk so much. Yeah, I got into Zen at the Berkeley Zen Center many years after reading On the Road. So this talk helped connect me that I think sort of Kerouac did pique my interest in learning more about it. I read On the Road and Big Sur, which, you know, for me was all about the trials of being a drunk.
Yeah, Kerouac was drunk. He died in his 40s, I think, of alcohol related.
Yeah, he talks about what a hellish experience alcoholism was in that book, but I never read Dharma Bum, so that's on my list now, short list. But I'm wondering, you said that Kerouac never practiced, so I was wondering if you'd just give me a little bit more info about his relationship.
He kind of practiced like a lot of the Beats did, and like Alan Watts tried to. You know, they'd sit down, they couldn't really cross their legs. You know, they couldn't really still their minds. You know, but he did a little bit. He practiced some. You know, he practiced some. Not, I mean, he didn't go through the kind of real training you would have got at Berkeley Zen Center. By the way, I interviewed Mel for One Bird, One Stone. There's accounts of some of the stories he told me in the book. Mel Weitzman, who was the abbot there, must have been when you were there, I would think.
LA Zen Center.
Oh, you were at LA Zen Center?
No, Mel was at LA Zen Center, right?
Oh, wait, no,
Yeah.
no, I'm thinking of the wrong name, sorry. Who was the abbot of Berkeley Zen Center for 40 years or something?
Was it Alan Snucky?
Mel Weitzman
Alan
was the first
Sasaki.
one, and then
It's before Alan.
goes on Alan. Yeah.
Isn't it Mel? No. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
not so important. But thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dave. Yeah.
Got another couple of minutes here if somebody has a comment or a question.
Any other questions, comments, complaints, or issues? Objections, interjections?
I have a question. Can I be heard?
Please. Yes. Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah. Could you, Sean, could you just say again who it was that was so impressed by Emerson's self-reliance?
Sokei-an Sasaki. Yeah, he said reading Emerson's self-reliance gave him his first breakthrough experience, enlightenment experience. Kensho.
Okay, thank you. And it sounds like I'm just using that as a pretext to state what I wrote in the chat again, and you won't be wrong. I guess I am just using as a pretext. But the famous quote by Emerson that dovetailed with what you said earlier about what happened to Zen when it was promulgated or institutionalized is Emerson's quote, "Institutions are the laughing shadow of one man."
Mm-hmm.
So just wanted to throw that out.
Yeah, definitely. Once things get too big, then money gets involved and government patronage gets involved, and you know, people start squabbling over who's in authority and the hierarchies, and all the wrong stuff gets emphasized, right? But it seems to be inevitable. And then it comes to America, and it's all gets refreshed again. And in fact, I've many times trained in monastic training with Japanese monks who came over here to America to find the real Zen because they heard it was really happening here now. So interesting, isn't it, how things move? Yeah.
Wonderful.
Anyone else? Yeah. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to read all the chats. There's a lot of them, and if I start reading the chats, forget it. I'll forget what I'm talking about.
Well,
Which I kind of do anyway sometimes. So
we're within less than a minute of our closing, so maybe we should wrap up, Sean.
sure.
Thank you all for hanging with us here for this hour and a half, and we hope everybody enjoyed this and got a lot out of it. And as Sean said, there is so much more for him to talk about. So maybe we'll do this again, and we'll pick up where we left off. So
Let's do a part 2. Yeah, there's a bunch more.
could be so much fun. So,
Yeah.
and Sean, sincerely, thank you so much for sharing your scholarship and all your inspiration and your good words and your humor. So we appreciate it. Thank you all for coming.
Great to see you all.